via YouTube, there is going to be like a 20-second delay or so. So trying that technology out now. Let's see, we wanted to first just go through and have the task force members just do a quick name and affiliation. I'll call you out and let us know if you have what burning question you would like to get answered today. Because as noted in the agenda, we're really going to try to focus on clarifying the state's interpretation of the statute and getting some agreement on that. And so that's kind of our objective of today. We appreciate you all taking the extra time to attend this hour meeting today. You know, we have another meeting next week. That's 2.5 hours, but we have so much that we really want to dig into that we thought it was important to have this special meeting. So I'll just go around and have folks introduce themselves. We're just going to go mostly through the task force members, and then I'll also introduce our guests after that as well. So Bill Green, why don't you kick us off?
Great, thanks. Bill Green with the RMH Group, mechanical engineer, representing the American Council of Engineering Companies.
And any burning questions you have?
Ooh.
So many.
You know, well, I would like to clarify how we treat Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, especially as it relates to fuel switching.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Jenny, you're next on my screen.
Good afternoon, Jenny Gonzalez, electrician by trade. I represent the IBEW, which is the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. We are in the Denver chapter, Local 68. At this time, no burning questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Katrina.
Hi, everyone. Katrina Manigan. I lead the Buildings and Homes team in Denver's Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency. And my burning question today is just a desire to understand what the goal is for our task force in terms of emissions and how that's measured. I think that's our big topic, though.
Yes, great, thanks. Will Tour.
I'm Will Tour, Director of the Energy Office.
Great. Kirk Longstein.
Hi everyone, Kirk Longstein. I am with Fort Collins Utilities, and I think I share the question with Katrina. So,
Okay, John Lauer.
Hi, John Lauer with Newmark, representing the operational side of all of this.
Awesome. Joel.
Good afternoon, Joel Danforth with United Power. No particular burning questions, just hoping to listen in and learn from the group.
Great, thanks. And yeah, sorry about this changed link. I realized I didn't want to keep doing my personal Zoom meeting, so I did update that in the Zoom, but if you had already copied it from something else, apologize for that. Glad you could all join now. Just doing introductions and letting people know your name and affiliation, and if you have any burning questions for this meeting today. So let's go to Karen Hancock.
Hi, Karen Hancock, City of Aurora, no burning questions.
Okay, Nori.
Sorry, just jumped on from the other meeting too. No, I think I was just rereading the comparison charts and trying to understand the metrics better and reading the responses to a lot of the questions because the technical side is my weak point, but no particular burning questions. So appreciate the homework readings. Thanks.
Yeah, great. Kara?
Yep. Hi, folks. Kara Carmichael from RMI. Thanks for holding this additional session today. I think my burning questions are really peeling back the emissions requirement in the law and really understanding what we can and should be driving towards and how we're structuring it, and really EUI focused or GHG focused is kind of my burning question. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Paul?
Right, yeah, Paul Hutton with Cunningham Group representing the American Institute of Architects. A question I have is from the agenda for today, Scope 1 versus Scope 2. So I'm curious, there are some Scope 2 complications that we might encounter, say owned vehicles or something. So curious to get into that discussion.
Great, thanks. Christine?
Hi, Christine Brinker with Southwest Energy Efficiency Project, and I don't have any burning questions.
Okay. Stacy?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Stacy Bumgarn. I'm at the Campus Energy Coordinator at Colorado State University. And I think my my burning questions would echo Kara's about just the focus on EUI versus GHG, but then also I want us to hopefully talk about someday the kind of a portfolio approach for property owners that have multiple properties and or campuses, and then just what that approach looks like versus just a single owner of a single building.
Great, thank you. That makes sense. And we will definitely have subsequent meetings where we dive more into those different pathways and options for building owners, depending on their circumstances. Cecil?
Good afternoon. Cecil Courtney, Pipe Fitters Local 208. I don't really have any big questions, just looking to get as much information as possible.
Great. And Kathy?
Hi, Kathy Barsner, NAP, Colorado. And any of the questions that I had have already been mentioned, so I'll just say thank you and not be repetitive.
Thank you. And I'm also joined, of course, by Diane from Lotus, Crystal from the Energy Office, Clay Clark from the Department of Public Health and Environment, and Josh Korth from the Department of Public Health and Environment as well. And Josh I'll tee him up a little bit later. He's going to help us walk through some of the various scenarios and potential calculations. So that should be really helpful. Again, thank you. Appreciate you taking the extra time today, this month, to have this meeting. I'm going to share my screen and go through a few slides with some clarification on how the state is interpreting the statute. So give me a second to do that. Okay, can you all see that in presentation mode?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so we'll go over a few of the what I consider easier potential questions that we've heard from task force members. First is which is our goal, our greenhouse gas emission reduction target, just for covered buildings under this statute or the entire building sector? So we are interpreting this reduction target just for covered buildings under this statute, those buildings that are 50,000 square feet or larger that are required to annually benchmark their energy use. So I wanted to clarify that first. And we'll go through a few of these slides, and then I think we can stop for, go to questions after this. The next question, are both Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions being considered under the BPS? Yes, our interpretation is that we want to reduce both Scope 1, which refers to the on-site direct emissions from fossil fuel combustion, and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions, which are those indirect emissions from purchased electricity. However, as you know, the statute states that the task force recommendations need to avoid double counting of Scope 2 emissions between buildings and utilities. That's where that greening of the grid language comes in, which I'll speak to next as well. We got a lot of questions around what will we use as the baseline year. Some of you may have been involved in the various iterations of this legislation last year when it was being considered. And originally, we did have some hardwired building performance standards that were listed in the potential legislation. And in that legislation, it did provide some flexibility to building owners over what they could use as a baseline year. However, when those building performance standards were stripped out of the final legislation or prior to it being passed, the baseline year was put in as 2021. So the statute is clear that the baseline year we need to use is 2021. Building owners, that's what we're going to use for that baseline.
Kim, just a quick clarifying question on that. Calendar year, January 1st
Yes.
to December 31st?
Yes, calendar year. Yes, good question. Thank you. And then that gets to the next question, right? Since we can't.
Hello? I'm sorry, Kim, I was just going to ask a quick question.
Sure.
Is there any concern on that 2021 year due to the fact that some buildings have still had limited personnel in them because of COVID concerns? We're seeing a lot of our businesses not coming back to full strength. So the energy use might be artificially low because of that. So how are we looking at accommodating that?
That's a good question. And I think that is definitely a consideration that the task force is going to have to look at and, provide those various pathways because unfortunately it is, we know that everyone's not back in their offices yet. Energy use is down in a lot of the commercial sector. So we'll definitely have to take that into account with our calculations.
I might just note that our 2021 or our 2020 benchmarking data didn't show as big of a variation as we expected. Commercial offices were down a little bit, multifamily was up a little bit. I can put a link to our dashboard if you want to play with seeing some of that, if anyone wants to look at it on the chat. But in Denver, it actually was quite a minimal effect, like 1 or 2%. It wasn't very large, surprisingly.
That's super helpful, Katrina. Thank you.
Kim, is this an appropriate time to ask a follow-up question, or should I wait until you get to the end?
Well, maybe we'll wait for now, and then we'll go through
Okay.
some of these a few other slides, and then we can open it up for more discussion. Thanks, Kirk. So then comes the next question. Since we can't take credit for greening of the grid, how should we calculate the emissions reduction? And obviously, as the memo, we're kind of restating some of the answers that we put forth in the memo, but really the intent here is to incentivize actions by building owners and not count in the actions that utilities are taking to actually decarbonize the grid. We want to make sure that building owners do take action to reduce their energy use and emissions. We realize that electrification, fuel switching is going to contribute to greenhouse gas reductions in different ways than simple electrical efficiency would. So we think that the task force needs to consider the greenhouse gas intensity of electricity versus the greenhouse gas intensity of on-site combustion. And so we need to look at how those reductions in both Scope 1 emissions and Scope 2 emissions can help us achieve the overall goal of a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And I think I have at least one more slide, which gets really to the crux of what people are asking, is that what emissions intensity should we use to calculate the greenhouse gas emissions reduction? And so the state's interpretation is that the emissions reduction would be credited at the actual grid intensity for the target years of 2026 and 2030. We feel like we need to do that because, again, the grid is decarbonizing. And in order to make these goals not only achievable, but not take credit for the greening of the grid, we need to look at those future greenhouse gas emissions intensities for the year of 2026 and 2030. And we have invited Josh Korth from the Department of Public Health and Environment. He is a unit supervisor at the Air Pollution and Control Division, and he has done a lot of the modeling and analysis of greenhouse gas emissions across the state. He worked extensively on the greenhouse gas roadmap, and we've invited him here to walk through a few scenarios to show how we would interpret and calculate different projects and emissions reductions. So I will go to him next.
Kim.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry for all these questions. Would you mind expanding on what you mean by actual grid intensity in that follow-up? I'm not sure if you can give an example or.
And I'll speak to that a little bit, Kim, as I go through these slides. So.
Great, thank you.
No problem. So I guess, Kim, did you want to take any other questions on any of your topics before we move into these, or do this first and then come back to questions?
Let's do this first and then we'll come back to questions, I think. Thank you.
Okay, great. So appreciate the opportunity, Kim and Will and this entire group to come and chat with you today. Over the last couple of weeks, I've been having some conversations with the Energy Office, with Clay Clark, the supervisor of the climate change program here at CDPHE, and trying to, I guess, put out some what I'll call preliminary ideas on how some of this calculation methodology might be able to be structured. And as I thought about it, and as we had these conversations, I tried to group them into different types of project categories. It was a good way to think about it. And I think as you all are aware, every building is different. The opportunities for energy efficiency or reduction in emissions are different with every type of building. And so, it made a lot of sense to us to try and group them into different categories and kind of come up with, what I'll call a framework for how this calculation would work. And so, kind of think about these in a little bit more of a holistic context, see if conceptually they make sense, and if they are, an opportunity to kind of be a starting point for building out a more formalized methodology, as this task force, goes forward. So the first type of project that I thought about was, replacing existing gas-fired equipment with something that's more efficient. And again, we would need to calculate that baseline consumption through the benchmarking process. And as Kim was talking about earlier, we kind of think about this as calculating emissions based on an intensity that is expected of the gas supply in that target year. And so, I think there's a number of opportunities to be able to collect and calculate this data, either through CDPHE or the Energy Office, or even through some of the work that is going on right now at the Public Utilities Commission with clean heat plans. And so, as the utilities are thinking about how they achieve their reduction goals, they're going to need to calculate emissions intensities of those future years. And, that might be an opportunity to make that information public where it can be used in this process in order to, calculate those baseline emissions. And so you would essentially start with the baseline consumption, you would multiply that by the expected emissions intensity, and that would give you your baseline emissions from which you're trying to reduce from. Then you would take a look at what are the impacts of the project, how much gas is going to be consumed in those future target years, and multiply by that same intensity rate to calculate your emissions reductions. And then, being able to, know your baseline number, being able to know your projected number, you simply subtract those to get the emissions savings for that type of project. Next slide, please, Kim. So what you're going to see on all these slides is the process is pretty similar. In all cases, we're looking at what that baseline consumption is, either gas or electricity usage. We're looking at how the project impacts that usage out to the target year. And then again, using those target year intensity rates, we are calculating what that emissions savings would be. And so, the next type of project that I thought about was not a replacement of existing equipment, but a tune-up or an optimization of that existing equipment. And this would work very similar to the scenario that we just talked about. The only difference is that you haven't replaced the equipment, you've actually optimized it. But in doing that, you have reduced that consumption number in those forward-looking target years and can calculate the emission savings in the same way. Next slide, Kim. Another category of projects that we thought about was replacement of gas-fired equipment with electric equipment. And again, we would calculate the baseline emissions in the same way using the gas consumption and that target year emissions intensity of the gas system. Unlike the previous two categories, we now have to look at that forward-looking electricity consumption and the emissions that would be associated with that electricity usage. Again, through the Clean Energy Plan process that all of the Colorado utilities are going through right now, or at least through their member ownership, are able to get those emissions intensities. We do think that this data is available within the next 6 to 12 months. We will have finalized plans for the majority of the Colorado utilities, and those utilities are required to project interim year emissions and load between now and 2030. And so we can calculate emissions intensity either on a statewide basis or potentially even on a utility by utility basis in order to be able to provide those future projected emissions intensities. And so, again, looking at your future emissions, you would estimate the amount of electricity that the new equipment is going to consume. You would multiply that by that emissions intensity value, and that would give you the associated emissions with the switch from gas to electric. Again, you would subtract out your future year emissions from your baseline emissions, and that would give you the emission savings for that type of a project. Next slide, please, Kim. And then very similar.
Sorry, I just want to check that they're advancing for folks. I got to note that. Okay, they are. Okay.
I see them advancing, so okay. I hope they're advancing for everybody.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and then the last kind of major category that I thought about was replacement of existing electric equipment with more efficient versions of electric equipment. And so similar to the first, or actually the second scenario, which was gas focused, this would look at the historical emissions from the benchmarked energy, multiply that by the emissions intensity of the target year, then would calculate the expected emission or expected consumption from the new equipment, multiply that by that same target year factor, and you would get the difference in both energy and emissions by subtracting your future year from your baseline. Next slide, please, Kim. And then, just maybe as a more of a conversation starter, I just tried to think of maybe some other categories of projects that might, be able to, provide, energy benefits and emissions benefits, updating the circulation within a building, improving the exterior installation, reducing leakage from windows, doors, other things like that. I think the big takeaway for me is that, we, I think, want to encourage all types of projects that are going to ultimately save energy and reduce emissions to be on the table for consideration. And, much like the other four scenarios, which were more, energy focused, I think these could also be a way to, just estimate the total energy consumption from a building or set of buildings, estimate the energy after projects are performed, and do very similar calculations to what we discussed on the previous slides. Last slide, Kim. And so then ultimately for demonstrating compliance, you would be able to sum up the energy savings from each category for which a project was performed. You'd be able to sum up the baseline emissions and energy consumption prior to the projects being performed, and be able to calculate that delta, that percent change from baseline to that forward year target year. So with that, I will kind of stop and turn it back over to Kim and Will and see what other questions might come up from this conversation.
Josh, could I ask you a question about the gas consumption and how you calculate emissions associated with gas? Would it be a single metric that you'd use for every therm of gas anywhere in the state, or would it be specific to the utility provider of the natural gas?
I think it could be done either way. I say that with the caveat that not all of them are probably providing that information at this point in time.
Yeah,
and so whether that becomes a requirement when they file a clean heat plan, whether CDPHE works with the utilities to develop what that number may be, or the energy office, I think that would be one of the things that this task force would probably want to recommend is what's the best way to get that number so that it's available and it's meaningful for the building owners to use.
Yeah, the other question I have for you, Josh, is what about propane? There are a few rural buildings large enough to qualify that do use propane as a source. Mm-hmm. So would it be a similar analysis there? You would try to get localized data for the emissions impact of that propane?
Yeah, I guess I don't want to say propane is easier, but I guess I see less variability going forward in the emissions intensity of propane than potentially with the gas stream if biofuels or ultimately hydrogen start being blended into the gas stream. I think propane is likely to stay probably more constant, really probably only be updated if EPA were to update their emission factors for that fuel going forward.
So you wouldn't consider transporting the propane to the site where it's consumed?
I guess I'm not sure. I think that's an interesting question. What are the transportation costs and emissions associated with that?
Great, thanks.
And Josh, really quickly, can you clarify for everyone, just because not everyone's a greenhouse gas emission expert like you are, of the difference between what you're proposing or what we're proposing with the greenhouse gas intensity and how that's different than how Energy Star may calculate greenhouse gas emissions or how they may intersect?
I haven't given that a lot of thought. I think that's an interesting topic to understand better. I don't know that I can really comment on it today without thinking about it a little bit more.
Hey, Josh, just one thing that I think is a crucial point of each one of your slides that has been a topic of some discussion and debate on the task force, and I just want to make sure that that there's an opportunity for folks to discuss this, is you'll see that the way that Josh has structured the baseline, it's baseline year consumption, but then for the purposes of establishing what we are reducing sector-wide by 20%, it's baseline year consumption using target year emissions intensities of both gas and electricity. So that's the way that we are interpreting the language that requires a 20% reduction, but also requires that reduction come from actual actions that affect the buildings, not from the baseline decarbonization of gas and electricity due to utility actions.
Yeah, and I think there's two ways you could do it. You could potentially apply an emission rate from 2021 to the baseline. I guess as I thought about it, with these being forward-looking projects, it made more sense if we can get the data to apply a forward-looking emissions rate as opposed to a backwards-looking emissions rate.
Josh, this is Bill Green. So if we do fuel switching and let's say a natural gas boiler converts to an electric boiler at a COP of 1, and and emissions go up because of that emission intensity at that particular year. How do we deal with that?
Yeah, I guess as I think about it, I think Colorado is in a pretty good spot with, much of our coal fleet getting slated for retirement here in the coming years. I'd have to go and look at what the most recent annual data looked like, but I believe we are getting pretty close, and it's my opinion that by 2026 the electricity will be less carbon intensive than natural gas. But you raise a good point. If the grid doesn't transition as quickly as we think it is going to, in the short term, you could potentially be looking at an emissions increase, where over the long term, you'll look at a substantial decrease over the life of the project. So, I think, like I said, over the next 6 to 12 months, we're going to have pretty much utility specific information for all of the Colorado utilities on the electric side with the clean energy plan filings. And we can make those projections and let the building owners really be able to make an informed and an educated decision, both from an environmental and a cost perspective, as well as an operational perspective of what project makes the most sense for their particular situation.
Yeah, and we've done some calculations, and with heat pumps, certainly it works, but for the big buildings that are high temperature systems, a COP of 1 actually causes emissions to increase until almost 2030. If a building can do heat pumps, great, but if they can't, then actually emissions could increase. I have another question with regard to load increase. We've got it seems like the statute says that we sort of have to cap greenhouse gas emissions at 2021 and reduce them. And so what do we do with load increase? Let's say load across the state for those buildings increases 20%. Does that mean that the emissions reduction has to go down 40% by 2030?
I think that is accurate. This is a mass-based emissions target that's sector-wide. And so it's not normalized by either building square feet or by, the, gross and plug load. I mean, it's just a mass-based.
Right. So it's really a 2021 emission cap. The way I interpret it, that we cap emissions at 2021, and as load grows, we have to reduce that cap 7% and 20%. Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, I was going to move to the people who had questions, who raised their hands. Sorry, Christine, I think you were next.
I'll go after Katrina and Stacy, if that's okay.
Okay, Stacy, I think you raised your hand next.
Yeah, maybe I'm just really too confused and on the wrong page of the hymnal here, but I guess the question I want to ask is what Josh just presented to us seems like considerations for how a building owner would decide and determine what projects to pursue and how to calculate the impact of those projects, which to me seems quite different than establishing what the performance targets and pathways are related to the statute. So am I misunderstanding, or are we getting ahead of ourselves with trying to figure out how to guide a building owner how to determine the type of project to select and invest in and calculate the savings from that? Or are we trying to decide, or is this actually supposed to be telling me how to understand what the performance metrics are? Does my question might not make sense because maybe I'm just that confused, but.
I had the same question. Yeah, my question was related to that, plus a couple follow-ons. So yeah, that'd be good to know.
Yeah, I guess maybe I'll start, and then Will, you can, or Kim, you can add on. I guess one of the things we were struggling a little bit with in our conversations is, without kind of knowing how the calculations will work, how do you start to estimate what the standard needs to be? And so, we have a little bit of a, chicken and the egg situation here, where we need to understand kind of how we interpret the statute and how those calculations are going to work in order to then have the conversation about how to appropriately set what the standard should be is. And Will, you and Kim obviously are a lot more involved in these conversations than I have been. I don't know if you feel the same way or have more you want to add to that.
No, I mean, I think the way that I would frame it is, we were trying to provide some specific illustrations that really get at the question of how are we looking at baseline emissions, and how are we interpreting what a 20% reduction below the baseline year looks like. I mean, that was really, I think, the point of those illustrative examples, because it just seemed easier to talk about sort of building specific examples than to talk in a more abstract way. But certainly agree that the standards, aren't going to be a set of prescriptive, building specific measures.
So my question was following along with Stacy, then, if I could jump in. I'm with you on how to calculate, kind of, at least I see what you're saying so far, but the slide that said demonstrating compliance, that's what I'm wondering about, because I think our hope was that it would be super simple for buildings to demonstrate compliance just by essentially submitting their benchmarking score for that year, and not have to say, I changed out this equipment and I projected it would be this, and then it's actually this, and all that. Was just hoping it'd be like, hit a button. So that sounds pretty difficult for building owners. I guess that's more a general task force question, that kind of simplicity thing. But I do get how it'd be good guidance, like Stacy was saying, for helping building owners calculate, is this project worth doing? Will this project get me to the goal? Okay, one other short follow-on question after that.
And Christine, I think this may be a matter of we didn't state it well, so completely agree. And from a state perspective, the only data we're going to have will be those benchmarking filings. So, and there's no world in which the state has the capacity to be tracking individual building measures all across the state. So really, this was intended to be illustrative of how do these measures actually contribute to reductions, and how are we thinking about the baseline? But completely agree with you that this has to be structured both so that it works for building owners and so that it works for the state, that it can only use the data that we're going to have.
Great to hear. And then a question I think to think about, but you don't need to answer it now, is with these calculations, you were saying like the greenhouse gas intensity in 2026, but if you put in a project in like 2023, you're going to get emission benefits for a few years, before the target year. So hope we can figure out how to account for that. But there's probably broader questions about this, but I think we're getting to in the nitty gritty. So
I think I have one of those.
Katrina. Yep.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I think I have one of those broader questions for you. The legislation seems really clear to me when I read it, that it says that we shall reduce emissions by the percentages stated below 2021 emission levels as reported via benchmarking in 2022. And so this methodology Josh is presenting that would assume greenhouse gas intensities of target years in the future, like 2026 and 2030, in 2021, like that's not what the legislation says when I read it. And I understand from your memo that you think that was the legislative intent. And I would like to understand how we can better understand that, because it's really straightforward when I read it. It's the language you put on the screen, Kim, that it says we have to reduce emissions 20% below the levels in 2021. Like, as reported through benchmarking, like it even tells us where we should get the data. I don't see how we can assume 2030 intensities for emissions when we're told it's below 2021 levels. Like, I'd like some clarity on like what is our baseline, because I hear you all interpreting it in a way that just is not consistent with what I see the legislation saying to us. I was not part of the legislative process at all. So I don't know if like we should like how we clarify that legislative intent. I understand it's going to be a lot harder if we assume 2021 baseline, but it very directly tells us to do that. And so do we need to at least have an option out of this task force that looks at like, what would it take to actually reduce 20% below emissions in 2021? What would the incentives and the support need to be? Because that's what it says to me. And I guess I don't know that we can make the assumptions you're making. I'm not comfortable with them right now, but I also don't know how to ground that legislative intent.
Well, I think that there is substantial deference given to agency interpretation of legislation where there is any ambiguity. And given the intersection of that language with the language around not taking credit for the basically the improvements in GHG intensity, together those do create a set of ambiguity that allows reasonable interpretation. And so, the general legal standard of giving deference to agency interpretation if there's any ambiguity, when you read the statute in its whole, when you're looking at that language and the language around not being able to take into account I forget the precise language, but not being able to take credit for the utility decarbonization, there's enough ambiguity there that there's room for a reasonable statutory interpretation and a workable statutory interpretation, which this is, which the other I think would not be a workable interpretation.
Karen?
I would love to hear from other task force members too, who maybe were closer to understanding this, because it doesn't seem ambiguous to me when I read it. It seems really, really clear how the math is supposed to be done. So I guess, but if I'm the only one struggling with this, I will stop. But it seems clear to me that it's a 2021 emissions level and baseline in the language. I would love to hear more from others.
Karen, did you have a question?
Well, I mostly had a comment. I guess I'm thinking, and I'm interested in all of the above, but we do want to make sure that we incentivize a menu of jobs for this industry. And I'm not hearing that we are getting a diverse menu of jobs out of what we just heard. So I'm assuming we can go past just equipment upgrades. So I'll just lay it out there since we're looking at high level. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. And yeah, we're not getting into the specifics, around types of projects yet. We'll certainly dive into that in future task force meetings as well. But those were just some illustrative examples that Josh provided. Certainly not meant to be the only types of projects that we'll look at. And again, probably won't even be that prescriptive. We'll provide, target perhaps potentially metrics such as EUI or something that, so building owners will likely have some different options in how they achieve those targets. Bill Green?
Yeah, Josh, I had another question from CDPHE's standpoint. When we normally do greenhouse gas emission calculations from buildings, we include refrigerant fugitive emissions. And when you switch to something like VRF, you can have significant refrigerant losses that increase GHG. Do we need to take those into account?
That's another very good question. I guess I would have to go back and look at the statute, and maybe Will can weigh in on this a little bit as well. But I guess when I think about building benchmarking, and I think it was mostly contemplated that it was energy, but I think you're right to flag that there are potential ancillary consequences or ancillary emissions that may be impacted by the type of project that is selected.
Yeah, because when you reduce natural gas, you get this great benefit. And certainly heat pumps are a great benefit too. But, I've read some studies where those fugitive refrigerant emissions can be significant. They can be perhaps 50% of the natural gas emissions. And the problem is that these heat pumps now use R410A, which is going to be phased out because of its high global warming potential. So it seems that we need to consider that.
So I think that's a question we probably need to go back and think about. I mean, one question will be is there any reporting as part of benchmarking on that refrigerant use? Since again, that's the data that we will have.
Well, certainly with greenhouse gas protocol spreadsheets, they do list refrigerant emission potential and require you to estimate it. So,
but if building owners are reporting via Energy Star Portfolio Manager, you're just putting in your energy consumption. There's no place to account for refrigerant use.
Right.
In my mind.
Right. But, Energy Star uses a national average for emission intensity. And it seems like we would be using a local aggregate emission intensity in future years. So it wouldn't come straight out of Energy Star.
So great question, and one that I think we'll need to give some thought to with CDPHE.
Kirk, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Katrina, I'm back on your question, and I wonder if we could hash that out a little bit, because I am really interested in kind of the goal setting piece of this as well. And I was looking at the kind of the Denver, your approach, you baseline from 2019. So if I understand your concern is that we're trying to set targets for data that we haven't even had a chance to take a look at. And so it's really difficult to set interim targets and long-term targets because we don't even know what the data is. It's data in the future. Is that the concern? Is that how I'm understanding it? Or I wonder if you could just explain that a little bit more.
That's not my concern. We could probably do a decent job estimating future intensity targets, like Josh had said. It's just a very different goal. And that's why I really think the task force needs to look at some real numbers here. Like, I would really appreciate it if the state could give us an estimated greenhouse gas emission level for all these buildings in 2021. I know you don't have the benchmarking data yet, but if we could start talking real numbers, that would be really helpful, because the grid will be so much cleaner in 2030. If you assume an emissions intensity of 2030 in the 2021 numbers, the emission levels are probably half of what they actually were in 2021. So the goal of this task force in terms of actual tons that we have to reduce is half if you assume 2030 intensity targets, which is what the state is proposing. I feel like the legislation reads really clearly that we have to assume 2021 emission levels, or maybe if they think it's not clear, we should work towards both and look at scenarios for both. Like, I just don't think it's clear cut when I read it, and I would love to hear from others, because it seems really straightforward that it says to use 2021 emission levels. If you assume, does that make sense? It's literally we have to achieve double the emissions reductions if we assume
that makes sense.
2021 baseline to the 2030 intensity target. And I can't even think about how we'd go about achieving these goals when I don't know if the goal is half or double what it.
Yeah,
I literally don't know the order of magnitude of what we have to accomplish at all unless we decide this. Or maybe we need to talk about both because it's not clear. So
would it make sense for this group to do scenario planning and just to kind of use some data to try to, do some, because rather than getting really tied up on that specific language, I wonder if we can start to kind of do scenario planning with existing data and just looking at those targets just in kind of these what if scenarios. And if that could at least advance the conversation.
I'd like to make sure that people sort of clearly understand sort of the magnitude of the issue here. So if you imagine for a moment that we moved to, zero emissions on the electric side, and all that we were left with were gas emissions. If you had a building that started out with 70% of its emissions coming from electricity and 30% from gas, if we took this interpretation, that building would in the end have to have an emissions level that was 10% in 2030 of the emissions that it had in 2021. It is a vastly deeper set of emissions reductions that are required. In the legislative debate on this, it was clear that what the legislature was targeting was a 20% reduction in emissions that were under the control of the buildings. And nobody was contemplating, potentially requiring much deeper reductions. So that in the real world, the total reductions will be much deeper than 20% because of the background decarbonization of the electricity, and in some cases, the decarbonization of gas due to clean heat plans. But it would be a much more stringent rule than was ever discussed during the legislative debate on this if we were to take one of these interpretations.
I'm recognizing that we only have a couple of minutes left. Let's hear from Kara. You had a comment or question?
Great, thanks. I guess just a few thoughts on this. I'm concerned that if we use forward-looking emissions rates, we're also creating a moving target for building owners because they won't know how they've measured up until that year is complete. And so that concerns me a little bit because it may hold up action. I think also stepping back to the ultimate goals that we're trying to drive here, as Will was getting at, I really think it's efficiency and electrification. And I'm worried that we're potentially overcomplicating things by pulling in too many grid emissions kind of factors that building owners might feel are out of their control. And I think this conversation for me is really kind of getting back to we want buildings to be more efficient. So let's let's create very clear signals for building owners to do that. We want them to be efficient and all electric. And so that's really getting at, for me, kind of enforcing EUI targets and then having some kind of complementary electrification component. So we're not making things unapproachable from kind of a typical building owner perspective. That's where my head's at.
Thank you. That's super helpful. We have like 2 minutes left. So just want to, Bill, if you have something really quick to say.
Kim, I put it in chat, you know, instead of going forward with emission intensity, we could fix emission intensity in 2021 and keep that same intensity going forward. And it would be the exact same thing that Josh is proposing.
Right. Good. Go ahead, Bill.
I don't know that that would work for electrification, however, because you've got such large changes happening to the relative intensity of gas and electricity.
Well, but if you are using the 2030 emission intensity for electricity for both baseline and future, then I think it's the same thing. You know, it's the same, you know, multiplier for either one. You know, you're using a multiplier times a usage at baseline and a multiplier usage in 2030 that's the same. So I don't think it matters.
Okay, we'll have to hold that thought for the next meeting and maybe we can dive into it further. But thank you all today. Really appreciate the time you spent and diving into this topic. Our next meeting is next Wednesday. I did update the Zoom link, so please look at your invitation for an updated Zoom link. Let me know if you need that. And we will also provide a synopsis during the next full meeting about what was discussed today. So appreciate everyone's time. Please reach out to me or Crystal if you have any, or Diane if you have any additional questions or follow-ups from this. But thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.